when I first started working with SharePoint, and when and certainly in the 20 years I've worked with technology. But even in the last 5 or 6 years, the world has changed significantly. And that applies to business, business, IT, and people indeed. So business has changed a lot. Our user base is now savvy with technology. When I started 20 years ago, it was hard to convince users how to even click a mouse and how to adopt to a new technology. Now users add a new app to their phone every hour or two, and they're used to figuring out how it works and making use of that technology in their personal and professional lives. Our workforces are distributed. We have people working increasingly away from the office, at home, or in remote locations. And we have the blurred line between work and personal lives, where we're checking email while we're on vacation, and we're also checking Facebook when we're at work. We're carrying devices that we never could have imagined several years ago, and we're connecting with each other using these social technologies that were really not even in our vocabulary as recently as 2007, 2008. And our workforce is very diverse. We have millennials coming into our enterprises who expect technology to work and expect solutions to be readily available and understand how to use technology and apply social constructs. We have older employees who, even if they're at the edge of retirement, are carrying around smartphones and understand how to use technology and are less frightened of the concept. So we have a diverse, capable workforce at our disposal. Now, IT has also changed a lot over the last couple of years. We've built an increasingly complex set of infrastructures on our businesses, at our businesses. We've started reaching into the cloud. We're drowning in data. The concept of big data doesn't only apply to business intelligence and insights. It also applies to that massive data that we're having to manage every day. User documents, files. Now we have large media formats like video and audio files. And we've got to find ways to work with that large data. And of course, every day we're struggling really to control the proliferation of information. Information that now is in clouds we don't own, on devices we don't manage. How do we keep on top of all of that? That is certainly one of the major challenges for IT. And then in 2007, 2008, we got hit by the recession. And just when we were ready to move past Windows XP, the recession hit and Windows Vista hit, and we put everything on hold as we were asked to do more with less and to support more users and more workloads with less resources in IT. And then there's the cloud. In the last 7, 8 years, the cloud has gone from a general conceptual discussion to something we use and touch every day. As individuals, as consumers, probably everyone in this room has some relationship with the cloud, storing photos, talking with our friends, storing data. But yet businesses have been a little bit slower to adopt the cloud, and we'll talk about why and what we can do to move forward carefully into this new world. So the world has changed a lot in the last 7 or 8 years, but perhaps even more interesting is how Microsoft has changed. I've been in the business for 20 years. I've seen a lot of businesses change. I've seen the American telecom companies have to change. I've seen IBM have to change. I've seen Microsoft have to change. And the change that Microsoft has gone through, in my opinion, is really nothing short of extraordinary. Culturally, structurally, and business-wise, the company has made gigantic changes. And Simon shared a lot of those changes with you, so I'd like to highlight some of those things. It was not long ago that when one would talk about Microsoft as an analyst, one would talk about the walls and the silos between the bit parts of Microsoft, where the Office team was doing one thing, and the Windows team was doing another, and the Bing team was doing a third. And they didn't talk much with each other. And often, because changes were being driven by engineers, different teams would be trying to solve the same problem. So we as customers would end up with 5 solutions. We'd end up with 5 ways to synchronize data, 3 ways to store data on websites. And it became very, very confusing for customers, and the messaging from Microsoft was extremely disjointed. Microsoft was also shackled for many years with regulatory constraints placed on it by the antitrust environments from the Netscape times, as well as some of the things that happened in the European Union in the 2000s. And Microsoft itself was having to invest significant resources just to move through the regulatory environments it was facing, and it was limited to what it could do by those effects. Now, as the decade progressed and we got later into the 2000s, Microsoft started investing enormous resources into building this cloud that Simon and his team now have showed us and have started demonstrating the scale of. So there was a period of time where we didn't see as much innovation coming from Microsoft, and one of the reasons for that was because they had thousands and thousands of engineers building the clouds, Dynamics, Azure, Office 365, Bing, Xbox, etc. And those resources were creating what is now an extremely valuable platform, but we weren't seeing that value as customers. And now that those engineers have been liberated from just simply building the cloud, we're starting to see a pace of innovation from Microsoft that's nothing short of amazing. So Microsoft has now broken down the walls across its divisions. The new One Microsoft is all about approaching the market with a unified voice, allowing those pieces of Microsoft to connect as much as possible and help each other solve problems. So they promise, for example, that we'll go from 5 sync solutions to 1. So if we want to get data offline, we're not having to talk about work folders and OneDrive and OneDrive for Business sync engines, but rather just one solution. We're starting to see that in the new APIs that are coming out, where they're starting to talk about groups as a single concept and construct, rather than having groups in Active Directory, groups in Exchange, groups in SharePoint, groups in Yammer. And we're now talking about trying to create that and address that need in our business one single way. That's a huge, amazing value for us as customers, because now we'll start hearing unified messaging even from the different parts of Microsoft, which hasn't been the case in the past. And we're getting unified experiences, as we know. Experiences that Microsoft is building to apply to PCs, tablets, mobile devices, Xbox, across the board as consumers and users of that technology that benefits us. And of course, as developers, we now, with the Universal Apps announcements, have the ability to start looking at how we can build apps one time and apply those to multiple devices. Microsoft, of course, is not just doing services now, it's doing devices itself. And who would have thought, 4 years ago that we'd be seeing Surfaces and amazing phones. And of course, Microsoft today announced there'll be a new Surface event in New York on May 20th. So one looks forward to seeing what they announce. Of course, the rumor mill is very strongly leaning towards a mini Surface, and I'm really excited about that, because I love my iPad mini, but I think I'll do a lot more with the Surface mini. And what about this? Who would have thought 3 years ago that you'd be able to open an iOS device and see this many apps from Microsoft running on that device? Microsoft has always understood that there were users who weren't using Windows, but that expression never came out in the form of products and services. And now, particularly in the Office division, they're doing an amazing job at delivering experiences across iOS, Android, and across various browser platforms as well. And so those experiences, like OneDrive for Business, now will span our experience as individuals, whether we're at work or whether we're in our personal lives, whether we're on a device that we can put in our pockets or a device that is chained to a desktop. And that is a huge, important change. All of these shifts together, any one of these shifts alone would be impressive. But to have seen Microsoft go through all this and prepare for it and then execute it in the last basically 2 years has been really amazing for me to watch as an analyst. And I think all of us as customers of Microsoft need to appreciate the effort that it took, because how many of us could turn our businesses around that fast? In fact, right now we're trying to do that and getting our businesses to understand the cloud, and we can't even get our businesses to do that in many cases. So Microsoft has changed. And finally, IT has changed. The story of IT is an interesting one, and the way I like to tell it is by thinking about IT and its relationship with the business in terms of service, cost, and control. It wasn't long ago that there was only business and IT. There was no real cloud as we understand it today. And IT had people and had objectives that it needed to meet. IT provided solutions and platforms that met those objectives. IT maintained all the infrastructure, it maintained all the control, and of course, it cost money. And then over time, businesses started looking at outsourced solutions. Other organizations that could, through economies of scale, perhaps deliver those business objectives at lower cost. And so the costs started moving into outsourced organizations. And those organizations built the solutions and the platforms and the infrastructures. And IT got squeezed down. But IT always had a role because it was usually in the middle between the business and the outsource, maintaining some level of control, maintaining some visibility of cost, But IT definitely got squeezed down until the business realized that what had happened along the way is that it was no longer getting the objectives it needed delivered from the outsourced organizations. It was often getting templated services and solutions that didn't really meet the business's objectives. And so the pendulum swung the other way, and we started to see insourcing again. And IT took it back and pulled back things that made sense to the business, and over time started delivering more platforms, more infrastructure, incurring more costs, becoming quite expensive along the way. And that's kind of where we were in 2007 and 2008 when the recession hit, and then IT couldn't do much from the constraints it hit at that point. So there became a gap in the late 2000s between the business and IT, where IT was so burdened by the infrastructure it had built and the platforms it had deployed, and it was so constrained by economic and technical factors that it really couldn't deliver what the business was looking for. And there started to be this tension between the business and IT, and that tension is reaching, or has really reached, a tipping point for us today. A couple of quotes that I have loved that I've heard from customers recently include, IT is an adversary, not an emissary. In some businesses, the business sees IT as a roadblock to progress rather than as an enabler. And Simon and Steve talked about using IT as an enabler. That's not happening because the infrastructure is so overburdened and costly that IT can't move forward. One of the largest companies in the world, their SharePoint lead said, "Our CIO is a chief infrastructure officer." They're so busy maintaining the infrastructure that has been deployed. All of the resources are put to the environment rather than to the business and the users. And the CIO has lost track of information and innovation. So IT is now in that tense place, being pressured further by the existence of the cloud. And the cloud, of course, offers services that are elastic and responsive and exciting and new. And the business sees the cloud as a place where it can get its services at extremely low cost, extremely easily. And what does that do to IT? Well, it makes IT seem slow and unresponsive. And the cloud seems like this wonderful new shiny toy where if the business just goes to the cloud, it can get what it needs done. And one of the other quotes that I've heard that really is informative as to the world we live in right now is a retailer in Australia, and their business lead said, "We're the ones with the budget. If IT can't deliver, we will go around them." That is the reality of business today. Business has the budget, IT doesn't. Business sees services that are out there. And what's different about the cloud than about the old world of outsourcing is that in the old world of outsourcing, it still was very expensive because it was for the whole business. Now, with the cloud, you can pick and choose services, many of which are free if you just drop down your email address and maybe a credit card for some future set of charges. The barriers to entry are so low that the business is really attracted to the cloud. And so where does that leave IT when you've got this shiny new toy that's responsive and cheap and exciting? Well, in my opinion, I think the cloud has brought us to a point where IT, as we know it, is really dead. And IT will exist, it will change, but it will never be the same as it's been before. Where IT needs to be is not in the business of infrastructure management or infrastructure technology or even information technology. It needs to be in the business of innovation technology. It needs to be the place where the business can go and say, we have objectives that need to be met. And it can broker those needs out to services. Some of those services might be out in the cloud. Some of those services might be on what we used to call on-premises infrastructure, private cloud. And IT just becomes a center of excellence that runs certain services that belong on-premises, but really is in the business of helping the business solve its problems, whether the services it needs are on-premise or in some public environment. So IT needs to be in the business of providing service, of aligning business with technology. People in IT understand technology and are able to evaluate it with more informed perspectives and more nuance than the typical business user. So if the business user is asked to pick technology, the business user can ignore somewhat critical criteria like information management controls. IT can be in the middle there, addressing business needs with technology, delivering an optimized solution that has optimized levels of control. One of the challenges I see with the current world is, and I do see business customers going straight to the cloud. Actually, I'll ask this. How many of you in your organizations have found that users are using some consumer level service, Facebook, Twitter, Dropbox, for business needs. Just curious. Yeah, look around you. That's a big number. Just almost 50% raise their hands. The business is going to IT. They see it as responsive. It satisfies their immediate need, but I think it's extremely dangerous for the near-term and certainly long-term viability of the business, because you start getting shadow IT that's not being managed, not being centrally monitored, audited, costs start being opaque, and all sorts of dangerous things happen that relatively quickly will end up hurting the business. So IT needs to position itself as a center of excellence, ensuring that the business can get the responsive service it needs at an optimal cost and with optimal levels of control. I personally think this is the most exciting time to be in IT this century. I think if I were in IT, if I were spending my days as an IT professional or a developer or even a platform owner, this would be the most exciting time to be in IT, because IT is now in the business of driving new outcomes. We're now given the opportunity to focus less on maintaining and investing and supporting environment, and now delivering new solutions and driving those outcomes, helping our business transform and build new experiences and advance innovation. As an IT organization, that's a great place to be. And there's still plenty of challenges for IT to solve as well. In this new world, the first challenge are these shadow IT or rogue applications, where users have gone off and created their own Dropbox accounts or have shared things in other ways. We need to start being able to pull those back together and ensure that we've got consistent administration and manageability of our environments. Another big challenge we've got is managing diverse services. It was hard enough to put all the pieces together on our on-premise environment. Now we're going to have to put pieces together where we're running, say, an Office 365 infrastructure with apps from Nintex or K2 or whomever that are plugged in, and how all these things work together. That's going to be an incredible puzzle to solve. Monitoring those, managing those is going to be a really fun and interesting challenge with lots of problems to solve. Security, compliance, vulnerability, still obviously a number one concern. Even more complicated now that we're distributing information into clouds and we are distributing information onto devices we don't own and manage. And the business of service brokering, of helping a business solve its problems with technology is, as I mentioned, a huge challenge. Now, from a pure career perspective, this means that we can turn from being reactive professionals who are sort of fighting fires to being proactive and helping our business overcome these challenges that this new world creates. That allows us to redefine our partnership with business and to really start leading, influencing revenue and growth for our business. Also means, hopefully, we get to play with the newest toys faster. And many organizations that I was in, as we headed into the late 2000s, the IT organizations were kind of depressed because they hadn't been able to deploy anything new since about 2006. And it was just kind of a bummer. Now, with the new world, if IT positions itself correctly, IT will in fact be able to explore and play with the newest toys fastest in order to help the business understand those toys. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be in IT. So that's sort of my view of the world right now. I believe the world's changed a lot, Microsoft has changed a lot, IT has changed a lot, and we'll come back and talk in a moment about how we can all work together to move forward effectively.